Hello again. So this is for Business Math, Chapter 1, Gross Income, Lesson 1.2, Overtime Pay. So we just did Lesson 1, and that was straight time pay. If you haven't watched that one and you're not quite sure how to calculate that, definitely, go back and watch it real quick. Because we're going to talk about straight time pay in here. So sometimes I'll carry forward and let you know exactly how to keep calculating that if they've already taught it to you in a different lesson. As always, you should have this book. You should have read through the section and looked at the examples and paid attention to any formulas or equations or anything like that that they've given you. So definitely pay attention to these things. The book will also give you some definitions on some of the terminology. And we're going to need to know some of the terminology. It's going to carry throughout business math, especially when it's talking about periods, as far as, pay periods, or when we get to interest, it's compounding periods, but they're the same type of idea. So a lot of the time when we're talking about periods, we talk about weekly. Well, there's not only weekly, there's bi-weekly, there's semi-annually, there's I want to say, what do they call it? Monthly? Not bi-monthly, that would be every other month. Darn it, I'm forgetting the word for that one. We'll come across it though. And I'll go through and I'll explain these terminologies when we see them, but they do mean different things and they change our calculations a little bit there. So pay attention to that kind of stuff. In this one, we're just gonna look at some overtime rate. So they always summary here, and then they give us a little spot where they put some formulas up top. Again, not all the formulas all the time, most of them, but sometimes they're left off. So when you work more than your regular hours, you might earn overtime pay. The overtime pay is usually 1.5 times your hourly rate. Your total pay is your pay plus your overtime pay. So remember, 1.5, this is something I want to bring up. You don't type this into a calculator, 1.5. Change it to a decimal, it's 1.5. And if you didn't know that off the top of your head, that's okay. All you have to do is take the fraction, and you can type this part into a calculator, go 1 divided by 2, and that'll tell you it's 0.5. So it'll take the fraction part and turn it into a decimal, and you can do that with any fraction, really. But we want to put 1.5 when we're multiplying instead of try to put 1.5 for fractions. So overtime pay equals the overtime rate times worked, the overtime hours worked. Remember, the overtime rate is 1.5, and I'm going to go like this, 1.5 times your regular rate. So that's how you get the overtime rate, and they don't go through and explain that. If you didn't either watch this video or read through the book, you may miss that on how to calculate what the overtime rate is. So it's 1.5 times regular hourly rate is. And then you multiply that by however many hours you worked overtime. Your total pay is going to be your straight time pay, which we learned how to calculate on the last one, plus your overtime pay. We are going to kind of review straight time pay right now, just because we're going to need to calculate that a few times here. But definitely make sure you're paying attention to the chapter work so that you know how to calculate these things moving forward. So Kelsey Newberg is a robotics technician. She earns $50 per hour for 40 hours and time and a half. So that's just another way to say 1.5, right? So not a big deal there. For overtime over 40 hours. So anything that she works over 40 hours, she earns her overtime rate. If she works 6 hours overtime, what is her total pay? So, and I'm going to change the size of this really quick because it's going to be too big to write on the page the way it is. All right. So she earns 1 per hour, and for 40 hours, right? She worked 6 hours overtime, which means she worked 40 hours. So her straight time pay is going to be $250 times, and this is not $250, $21.50 times 40. That's going to give me her straight time. And then I'm going to add her overtime rate. So her overtime rate is anything over 40 hours times this little formula here. So we have 1.5 times 2150. So this in times 6 hours of overtime. So this is her regular straight time pay and her overtime pay. So we have both of them there, and we're just going to add them together. So 2150 times 40, that would be a regular 40-hour week. That's what her straight time pay would be. And then plus 1.5 times 21. Remember, that gives me her overtime rate, and then times however many hours she worked overtime. So when we multiply these together, let's see. Don't believe. So one thing I did do to clean this up a little bit, you really need to write the 1.5 each time. If you just automatically, kind of off to the side here, go 1.5 times 2150, like this, then you'll get the overtime rate, and it's a little easier to type or write into your equation. So I 32.25 for her overtime rate. So I can say, instead of 1.5 times 2150 over here, I can just write 32.25 times her 6 hours like that. So kind of two different ways. It's not really going to make a big difference either way. Note the overtime rate first and then just fill in your equation. Makes the expression here, sorry, not equation, but I haven't put an equal sign on it yet. It makes it look a little simpler without the 1.5 times 21.5. So when we multiply her straight time pay and add it to her time pay, we get a total of 53.50. So if we take a look at individually, and of course you can get out your handy dandy calculator there, and you would get, forgot the zero when I multiplied that, there we go. So we get 860 for her straight time pay, and then we get 32.25 times 6, so 193.50 for her overtime pay. And we simply just add these two amounts together, and that gives us our pay with overtime hours. All right, so in this first one, they told us she gets the 40 hours, she works 6 hours, but they're not always going to say it like that. They're actually going to start to combine them a little bit more, or even give us different scenarios. So here, I'm going to move down a little bit so we can kind of see. So for example, with this one, I'm just going to read this one. I'm not necessarily going to solve it. I'm just going to read through it and kind of talk. So as a children's librarian, Jody Hassam earns $15.35 an hour. So we know how much she earns per hour. And plus time and a half for weekend work. So time and a half for weekend work. So they're telling us when to apply the time and a half. Last week she worked 40 regular hours. So regular hours is 40 hours plus 16 hours on the weekend. So we're going to multiply our rate for 40, our regular rate, but we need time and a half for these 16 hours. So off to the side here, we're going to have to, do time and a half times 15.35 so that we know what her overtime rate is. And that's what we're going to multiply by the 16 because she gets more on the weekends. They may also, let's see, like one like this. Georgia LeBrand, sorry, took me a second, LeBrand installs fencing. She is paid 50 cents per hour. So we know what her straight time pay is, or her straight time rate is for an 8-hour day. And she gets time and a half for overtime for any work over 8 hours a day. What is her pay for a week when she works 7, 9, 10, and 10 hours? So they want you to go through and break this up. So for 7, that's only going to be straight time pay because it's not over 8. But there's 8 and then 4 more. So she did 4 overtime hours there on the second day. On the third day, she did 8 and then 1 more because it's. So make sure you break this up so that you can kind of see how many overtime hours did she should get. So 10 and 10, she worked 8 and then 2 more, 8 and then 2 more. So if we add these together, we'll get what her straight time rate hours are, and we can multiply that answer by the 950. But these hours are overtime. So make sure you take the 950 and you multiply by 1.5 so that you know what her overtime rate is, because that's what you're going to multiply the second piece by. And then you're supposed to add those two pieces together, just like we did up here. They're just giving it to us in a different way. So make sure you're paying attention to how they're giving it to you there. All right, so I'm going to look at this next page here. I'm going to move up. All right, so kind of very similar idea to what they just gave us here on number 8, except they're giving it to us in a table now. So it says Malik Boykin is paid $8.20 per hour and time and a half for any work over 40 hours per week. Find his total hours and gross pay for each week. So we need to find his total hours for the week, which means that we're going to need to take all these numbers in here and we're going to need to add them together. Add, and have a total. And same thing for the second week, we're going to need to add all of these together and get a total here. That's not our answer. That's not what we're going to write on the line. We need to decide if it's 40 hours or less, we're going to multiply by his hourly rate. But if it's 40 hours, we need to multiply the first 40 by the hourly rate. Anything over 40, he's going to get his overtime rate, which is 1.5 times 8.2. That's his overtime rate. To pay attention to the answers you get, and I'm going to let you know one of those two is going to be over 40. So you're going to have overtime calculation in one of those two columns, or sorry, rows. Go to. All right. So the next one, very, very similar, but you're just being given the information in a word problem here. So make sure you break it down. You know, how much has he worked, and how do I apply the overtime? You have to pay attention to how it's telling you to apply the overtime rate. One new thing, and I don't remember if this is the first one that told us this. Let's see. It may have come up in one of the other ones. I forgot to note it on one of the other ones here. Yeah, so number 7. It comes up in number 7. But I'll point it out here. So they tell us double time. So we have time and a half, which is overtime. That's regular overtime, which is 1.5 times your rate. Double time means you're going to multiply by 2 because it's double. So sometimes you get 1.5 times your rate. A lot of times if you work over 8 hours or if you work more than 40 hours, it kind of depends on where you work there. And then depending on the day you're working, like a lot of the time, if it's a holiday or if it's a Sunday, you'll get what's called double time. So you'll get even more. And that just literally, you do 2 times whatever the rate is, which in this case is $14.50. So that would be the double rate, the overtime rate, because we're going to use both of them in this problem, would be just 1.5 times 40. So we have 2 calculations to do here, kind of simple calculations, but that way we know what they're being paid at those different times. So normally you are, as a computer technician, are being paid $15.40, but when it's time or time and a half, you're getting 1.1540, and then when it's double time, you're getting 2 times 1540. So pay attention to the wording there. All right, let's look at this algebra here, because sometimes this does get a little bit more involved with the algebra piece, so I will admit that. Jane Abel is paid $14.85 an hour for a regular 40-hour week. So we know how much Jane is paid for 40 hours. Her overtime pay for any hours over 40 per week is time and a half. So we can already do a calculation off to the side here based on that. Whoop, don't know why it didn't write the 4. We'll write that out in just a moment. This past week, Jane earned $727.65 in total pay. How many hours time did she work this past week? So you want to understand that total pay equals your straight time pay plus your overtime. So usually that's not using an O for your variable, as it looks like a 0, but in this case, hopefully we can keep that straight, just so that we know it's straight time pay and overtime pay. It kind of makes it easy to identify. So time pay is your rate times your hours. Overtime is 1.5 times your rate times your hours. So we have everything we need. They're just asking us to apply it in a slightly different way. That's all. So we know we're going to have to add these things together, and it's going to give us our total. So they also told us what our total pay was. It's $7.27.65. I can write that in instead of T. We know what our rate is. It's 14.85. She gets 40 hour or 14.85 for 40 hours. And since we're calculating overtime, she must have gotten her 40 hours, right? That makes sense. If we're going to that overtime rate, then she must have already got it. So then we have 1.5 times our rate, which I wrote off to the side here. We just haven't calculated it quite yet. And then we have times hours. We don't know how many hours she's worked overtime. That's actually what it's asked to find. Whoop, cross it off. How many hours of overtime did she work last week? So we want to find this H. That's our goal here. And I know it starts to look a little longer, and I start to lose a few students here, but we're going to reduce it here pretty quickly. So if you do some of your multiplication here, so we have 14.85, 40, and we get 594 plus 1.5 times 14.85, and we get 22.275. Try not to round too early in your problems. That actually will kind of mess up the calculation if you round too early. So try to leave, at least 2 or 3 digits in there until the very end, and then you can round it down. I would probably even leave 3 or 4, just to make sure that it doesn't change too much. It probably will only change it by pennies, but it does change things. All right, so now we have a much more simplified equation here. This is a 2-step equation. I know the decimals, again, depends on the student there, but it's a little bit more stressful here because it looks a little longer, but it just has some decimals because we're talking about money. So we're going to the 594 away from the H. Remember, we're trying to solve for this H. So we're just going to move away all the pieces that are by the H to get it by itself. That's how we solve for it. So first, you want to move what's being added or subtracted. Be careful with this because sometimes I'll say that, move what's being added or subtracted, and students go, well, it's plus 22.275. 22.275 is being multiplied here. When they're snug like that, they're being multiplied. It's a positive 22.275, but it's not being added. The one that's being added is the other number that's not attached to the H. So this one, there's not a plus sign in front of it, but we're adding 594 on this side. So we're going to subtract it from both sides, and we're 133.65, and that's going to equal these two cancel, which is what we wanted to happen. And so we're going to bring down 22.275H. Now we can deal with this 22.275. Since it's being multiplied, we can divide by 22.275 on both sides. 22.275. Scrunching up a little more. I think I have more room down here at the bottom. Boom. Okay, so now we divide on sides like this. So we end up with 6 when we divide these two numbers equals 22.275 divided by 22.275. Cancel any number divided by itself, and we end up with H. So she worked 6 hours of overtime last week by going through and doing this. Not a super crazy calculation on this one. It's algebra, but it's more basic algebra. We're still at the beginning parts, but they did ask you to write the equation, so that's definitely a more involved question. You have to understand what you're being given, how to break it down into the two pieces here, and then plug in everything and simplify until you solve for your missing piece there. So, well, I hope that helped, and I will see you on section 3.